Hello and welcome to the second and final OHSAA statewide local interpretation meeting. This is BJ Duckworth, Director of Officiating Development and State Rules Interpreter for the sports across country and track and field. Before we jump into the content, I want to review a few important notes and reminders. The first one being that if you have not already completed your state rules interpretation meeting, you have until March 26th to do so without a late fee. Also, if you have not reviewed the 2022 Coaches and Officials Manual, I encourage you to take some time to review it and save an electronic copy or print one if you wish. This manual can be found on the track and field page of ohsaa.org. The NFHS does provide free educational material for sports officials. There is a great video presentation available that covers track and field. This course is, again, free. It is very flexible, as you can start and stop at any point, and it will pick up where you left off. It is specifically helpful for new officials. I encourage anybody with 6 or less years of experience to view it. It is also helpful for veteran officials who may be getting into a new officiating role. And finally, I encourage everybody to be actively recruiting new officials each and every day and at every meet we work. The need for new officials is growing each and every year, and anything we can do now to help recruit officials will pay dividends in the future. Today we're going to have a short message from the Ohio Association of Track and Cross Country Coaches, and then we're going to dive into seated events, starting off with state meet qualifying and ending with some resources available to officials and meet managers. And finally, we are going to cover severe weather awareness and walk through everything we need to know about lightning and weather preparedness. As I mentioned, we're going to start with a message from the Coaches Association, and we are going to hear now from Andy Cox, who is the president of the Ohio Association of Track and Cross Country Coaches, as well as Anjanette Whitman, who is the vice president of the Coaches Association.
Hello, my name is Andy Cox, and I'm at Thomas Worthington High School. I'm the president of the Ohio Association of Track and Cross Country Coaches.
And I am Anjanette Whitman from Lutheran West High School. I am the vice president of the Coaches Association. We thank you for your continued service. The Coaches Association is over 1,000 members strong and values the collaboration between the officials and our coaches for the betterment of our sports.
As a result, our student athletes will enjoy the best experience possible. Please contact either one of us for any questions or concerns, and we look forward to the opportunity to work with you in the future.
Thank you, Andy and Anjanette. We greatly appreciate your partnership, as well as all the work you and your fellow coaches across the state do to help move our sport forward and help benefit our student athletes. We're going to start off our conversation about seated athletes with a little bit of the history. In 2013, Dale Gabor spearheaded the historic edition of the seated division in Ohio. The work that he did and many others dates back prior to 2013, but we did have 35 entries in the 2013 state tournament, which was the first year that seated athletes were able to compete in OHSAA track and field. At that time, Ohio was only one of a handful of states to include seated athletes in its sport, and we remain a leader in this inclusion and are one of a handful of states that does include these events in our state tournaments. Since 2013, participation in seated events has nearly doubled. In 2021, We did have 68 entries in the state tournament, and it is estimated that we had over 200 athletes participating in the sport. Athletes do have the ability to compete in the seeded 100, 400, and 800 meters, as well as the seeded shot put in the state tournaments. It's important to note that during the regular season, seeded athletes do have the ability to compete in any event, as long as that event does not have an inherent safety risk to the seeded athlete or other athletes, and does not include any modification of the rules that has not already been made. When the seeded division was created in 2013, the Ohio Department of Health did estimate that between 6,000 and 8,000 students in Ohio alone would be directly impacted by the addition of the new division. We're going to jump now into state advancement procedures and talk a little bit about how seeded athletes can qualify for the tournament. Unlike footed athletes that do compete through the district and regional and state tournament, there are slightly different procedures for seeded athletes. Seeded athletes do have the ability to compete at meets that have FAT, and those meet managers will report those FAT times or throwing distances into the database for qualification to the state tournament. If there are 9 or less competitors that do qualify based off their time, they will compete in one section at the state tournament on Saturday during the finals. Those competitions are spread evenly throughout the day, one in each of the 3 current divisions, to ensure that those athletes do get exposure to the same type of crowds as footed athletes would. If there are 9 to 18 competitors that qualify based off their time, they will compete in 2 seeded heats on Friday, just as the footed athletes, and they will determine the 9 qualifiers to the finals on Saturday. If we do have 19 or more, we will use regional competition the week before the state tournament to narrow that down to 18 advancers who will advance to the state meet, and then follow the qualifying procedures into the finals for their events. Before we move on in seeded athletes, let's take some time now to hear the story of 2 seeded athletes from Mahoning County and their path to the state tournament.
Mahoning County's only 2 seeded track athletes will be competing this weekend at the OHSAA State Track and Field Championships. After finishing in the top 10 at states both his freshman and sophomore years, Boardman senior Micah Beckwith will be competing in all 4 seeded events, the 100, 400, 800, and shot put.
I've been pretty lucky. I've been able to qualify for states almost by the first or second meets every year. So after that, I just kind of focus on my own times, and if there's other seeded athletes, I just try to compete against theirs if there are any. But for the most part, it's just trying to improve on my own times.
In his second trip to states, Canfield Junior Cody Pivert will be competing in the 100, 400, and shot put. He says no matter the result, he is proud of his accomplishments this season.
Even if that means I'm getting last place or 5th place in a heat or in, finals or semis, I still know at the end of the day all that work that I've done during that season has paid off massively.
While competing on a big stage, the pair hopes to bring awareness to seeded athletes and inspire others.
We're getting the message out there that not all people who do sports are able-bodied. And that's a big, big, big part of it, is getting out there, showing the world, and particularly other disabled people, that, hey, you can get out here and do this too. All you gotta do is really, really, really want it.
Beckwith and Pivert are friends off the track and are looking forward to racing each other.
Most of the local meets we end up seeing each other, so we race against each other pretty often. And actually, I have him added on some social media and stuff like that, so we keep in touch.
It's definitely a friendly rivalry, is how I would phrase that. A very friendly rivalry. Like, we're really good friends off the track. On the track, though, we get down and dirty.
Duckworth and Pivert will be competing at Hilliard Darby High School. Their first event, shot put, is scheduled for Friday at 1 p.m.
That is a great inspirational story of how those athletes, have embraced the sport and are using their platform to help grow it. We're now going to move into the general rules and regulations for the seated events. So first, although only the 4 events are currently competed at the state championship, those events are the 100, the 400, the 800, and the shot put. It is important to note that seated athletes may enter any individual event offered at a meet or invitational as long as the athlete does not exceed the maximum number of events allowed, which is 4, the same as all other high school track athletes. It's important to note that a seated athlete cannot participate in a running relay, and this is due to the fact that seated athletes competition in events outside of the 4 approved for the state tournament must follow competition rules, and additional modifications cannot be made. So Rule 5.10.6 does stipulate the baton must be carried by hand, and that is not possible for seated athletes. Also, and more importantly, a seated athlete's participation in a running relay does have an inherent increased risk of injury to both themselves and the competitor. A seated athlete, however, may participate in a field event relay with footed athletes in a relay style meet. If 2 or more seated athletes are entered in competition in the same event, we ask that the seated athletes race in a separate heat from the footed athletes. However, if there is only 1 seated athlete entered in the event, the seated athletes should be permitted to race in the same heat as the footed athletes. We never want an athlete in general, let alone a seated athlete, to be forced to compete alone. If only 1 footed athlete enters the event, the Games Committee does have the authority to decide if the seated athlete will score in the same event with the footed athletes, or if the seated athlete will score in a separate seated event. This decision by the Games Committee or by the coaches should be determined in advance and shared with all appropriate parties, including the officials and the visiting schools, so that everybody can make the proper arrangements. If more than 1 seated athlete enters the event, our hope is that that event is competed and scored as its own separate event. A seated competitor should earn points for his or her team, even if they are the only competitor. However, schools do have the ability to reach an agreement on how the scoring will be handled with seated athletes if they are the only athlete. This is similar but not the same as what takes place in the pole vault. In the pole vault, if they decide not to score the event due to the prohibition on exhibition competition, you would not be able to compete the pole vault if it is not scored. However, in seated events, the OHSAA does specifically state that if a seated athlete participates in an event that is not scored, it is not a violation of the prohibition on exhibition events. However, we do strongly urge that seated athletes score whenever possible. Prior to each meet, the coaches or the Games Committee will confer and decide if and how they wish to score the seated athletes in each of the individual events. Again, we encourage that every reasonable effort be made to allow seated athletes to earn points for his or her team, meaning that if a seated athlete is representing each of the competing schools in a meet, the results of that event should be scored in the team scoring. Schools hosting invitationals are encouraged to include events for seated athletes. That can be the 4 events in the state meet, or they can choose to offer additional seated events, such as the seated 200, the seated, mile, the seated discus. However, as we mentioned before, seated athletes cannot compete in a running relay, but they do have the ability to compete in a seated relay. Host schools may select those eligible events, but they must notify the schools competing in advance so that they can make arrangements to bring seated athletes for those. Seated athletes must comply with all uniform regulations, and coaches are strongly encouraged to review the uniform rules and request appropriate waivers from the OHSAA related to medical issues that may prevent a seated athlete from complying with uniform rules. For example, in some instances, seated athletes are unable to wear shoes, and the coach would need to request a waiver from the OHSAA related to that change. We're going to move into discussion of the different types of equipment that are used specific to seated events. And we're going to start off with the track chair. The track chairs can be very intimidating, and many times these chairs are very expensive as well, and therefore sometimes they're shared or borrowed. But the track chair shall have 2 rear wheels and 1 front wheel. The frame cannot extend beyond the front of the center of the front wheel. These chairs can have no mechanical gears or levers that could help propel the chairs. And the seats, including the cushions, should not exceed 25 inches in height. And steering must be hand operated. They cannot use any sort of electric means to steer the track chair. Additionally, no part of the chair may extend past the back of the rear wheel. The athlete's legs or lower limbs must be secured to the chair. At no point can they touch the surface of the track, and if they do so, that would be a disqualification from the event. That is a very safety-heavy rule. Competitors are responsible for their own chairs and to ensure that they are properly functioning. No event should ever be delayed or rescheduled due to equipment failure prior to the event. Again, it is the competitor and the coach's responsibility to ensure that they are functioning properly. And no official should ever try to attempt to repair an athlete's chair if it is broken. Again, that is the athlete and the competitor's responsibility. The track chair is an extension of the athlete's body. Therefore, no part of the chair may be wider than the track lane. The wheels on this track chair can have a maximum diameter on the rear wheels and inflated tires of 28 inches. The front wheels and inflated tire can be between 20 inches and 10 inches. And each of the rear wheels may have a hand rim. This is what the seated athlete uses to propel the chair. Safety gear is required for these events. Athletes should be wearing helmets and gloves. All competitors need to wear a CPSC certified helmet. This helmet is a standard in bicycling and skateboarding. It is not the official's responsibility to check this. It is the coach's responsibility to ensure that their athlete is properly equipped. All competitors must start the event with racing gloves. If the glove does come off during the race, that is okay, but they must start the race with that glove. And athletes may only propel the chair forward by pushing on the wheels or hand rims. This goes back to the previous conversation related to gears and levers and electronic means. While seated athletes do utilize the majority of the same rules as footed athletes in these races, there are some specific regulations that need to be followed. The first of these specific regulations is related to the start. The center of the front axle or axle pane may not extend over the starting line. This is the same as you would enforce a athlete who is doing a standing start, ensuring that his foot does not extend on or over the starting line. For the races that involve seated athletes, the starting command should be the same as they would be for a footed athlete, which in the 100 and the 400 would be on your marks, set, and the firing of the starting device. In the 800 meter would be on your marks and the firing of a starting device. It is important to remember that starters should refrain from using the term runners stand in your lanes when there are seated athletes involved in a race. You should move directly to the on your marks command. And also, it's important to note that you should not use the term wheelers in any way in your commands as they are seated athletes. The second regulation is related to the finish, and that is very similar to the start, in which the front axle or axle pane is the point in which the FAT operator or hand timer should be determining the order of finish. And the third one would be obstruction. Athletes may not touch or obstruct another competitor during an event. Obstruction would result in disqualification. One important note here is that while it is unpopular to call a violation on a seated athlete, it is appropriate to disqualify an athlete when they do obstruct another seated athlete. For races in lanes, the 100, 400, and 800, they should be run the same as the footed athletes races, meaning that the 100 and the 400 should be run in their lanes the entire time. The 800 meters should use the same staggered and cut lines or break lines as the footed athletes. Touching or crossing over the lane line for seated athletes, it is 10 consecutive feet for disqualification, not 3 consecutive steps. So it's important that umpires are watching for that, specifically in the 400 and the 800 on the curves, to ensure that no advantage is gained. And crossing a lane line for any distance and impeding another competitor, the same as in a running event that is in lanes, is a disqualification. It is not necessarily a violation if they were to move outward during the race, as long as they did not impede another competitor. Again, the same as in running races, but they must finish in their lane. Seated athletes must have full clearance of another athlete's front wheel in order to pass or move into another lane. Again, very similar to the rules that we follow with footed athletes. And failure to pass or change lanes correctly will result in a disqualification. We're going to move on to the seated shot put and discuss some of the differences between the standard shot put and the seated event. First, all competitors must put the shot from a chair. This can be a manual wheelchair, a throwing chair, or a powered wheelchair. Scooters and standing chairs are not allowed. The athletes are very familiar with the appropriate chairs that they should be using, as are the coaches. The upper most part of the cushion and seat on any chair may not exceed 29.5 inches. The frame is allowed to have a holding bar, and you'll see in a later video the athlete holding that as they throw. It gives them some stability. That holding bar must be fixed, so it can't move. It can't have any joints. No part of the throwing frame or chair can be outside of the circle, no different than a footed athlete when they enter the circle. And the chair is an extension of the athlete's body. So if any part of the chair does touch the top of the stopboard, that would be a foul. That is not likely based off the strapping of the chairs, and we'll talk about that in a later slide. A coach only or coaches may assist the athlete in getting to the competition area, and they may assist the athlete in entering and exiting the circle. They do specify here that it must be a coach. Another school official would be appropriate. What we don't want are non-board approved individuals giving assistance to the athletes, so no parents, things along those lines. The school does not have to provide tie-down straps for a throwing athlete. The coach may hold the chair down during the throwing attempt to prevent the movement, but in every instance that I have seen, the school does provide tie-down straps. Those straps are connected to stakes that they put in the ground, and it provides great stability for the chair. One buttock cheek must remain in contact with the seat during the throw. This is a very different rule than for footed athletes, and it does require officials to be in a different position towards the rear of the ring rather than on the sides in many instances. But it is important for fair competition that officials are viewing for this and calling it. The size of the shot put in the seated events is the same as for the footed events. And specifically in invitationals, and this happens at the state meet as well, that athletes who are in the seated events are able to compete in the same flight as able-bodied athletes. I do encourage meet managers to take time to ensure that they are looking at when the seated athletes will participate, just because of the time it takes to get the chair into the circle and stake down and the athlete in the chair. So it is typical for seated athletes to take all of their preliminary attempts at once to avoid that downtime. There are resources available for you related to seated athletes. New this year, we have created a seated athlete competition guide that will be available on the track and field tournament page under seated division. This document will include frequently asked questions, all of the guidelines we reviewed today, as well as all of the paperwork that coaches would need, the medical paperwork for an athlete to qualify for seated competition. And then it also does include meet manager and coaching checklists that are very helpful in ensuring that both coaches and meet managers are ready for the next steps. Before we move on to severe weather, let's hear the story of two Edgewood High School seated athletes and learn a little more about their journey.
Thank you so much for joining us once again. In the world of sports, beating your personal best and the competition, always the goal.
Now imagine adding a physical challenge to the mix. Two Edgewood High School students who compete in track and field know a little something about that. They are seated athletes, meaning they use wheelchairs, but that hasn't stopped them from going to the state tournament. Lots of prep goes into big competition. It's why Kyle Helsinger is getting in final reps.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Before the state tournament.
I'm going to state for track and field. It's cool.
His teammate, Natalie Watson, agrees. The two make a rare duo. Very few high schools in Ohio send two seated athletes to state. This year, Edgewood High is doing just that with Kyle and Natalie.
They're all really supportive of us. They're always cheering us on. And I don't know, I think they just like watching us because we have to do it differently, but we are still doing the same thing that they're doing.
Doing the same thing, just from a seated position. In Natalie's case, it's shot put.
Ah, good. You're good, man. Just remember, keep that elbow up and take your time.
On the guys' side, Kyle's competing in that and the 100 and 400 meter races. Ohio has a couple hundred high schoolers who fit the medical definition to compete as seated athletes. Only about 40 made it to this weekend's tournament. It's one reason Kyle and Natalie have a proud coach.
Things have just improved and gotten better, and we've had a ton of fun with it. And I would say that's probably the most important thing, is we've just had a blast. It's been great.
He says they worked hard all season, trained every day, and are dedicated team members who set a great example.
Everybody loves them. It's like we go to track and field meets, and they're like celebrities to everyone.
And now they get their super bright spotlight at state.
It's really exciting.
I want to wish them the best of luck up there, because we're really proud of them. It doesn't matter what happens up there. We're proud of them, and Edgewood's proud of them, and we're all behind them.
And we want to wish them the best of luck, too. The Ohio High School Athletic Association tells me it opened competition up to seated athletes back in 2013. It started with about 25 in the whole state. As you just heard, it's up to about 200 now, Craig.
We all know how unpredictable Ohio weather can be. We'll start the outdoor season and be concerned about weather and cold temperatures, and we will end the season being concerned about humidity and heat illness. But one consistent all year long is the threat of severe weather and our role in being aware of the safety steps that we need to take. Talk about being prepared a little bit. Before you go to the meet, in the days prior to the meet, it's very important to understand what the forecast is. Are they calling for rain showers during the meet? It might not be severe weather they're calling for, but any weather, any rain could cause some safety issues, so it's important to know. Meet management, the meet referee, you need to ensure that you're monitoring weather during the event, especially if there is the chance for severe weather or pop-up thunderstorms. Ways to do this. We're very fortunate in today's day and age with smartphones and weather apps. They also have lightning detectors that are available that schools will use and many officials have, as well as weather radios. The important thing is that you're monitoring the development of the severe weather, not how you're monitoring it. And also make sure you know the plan for that site. If it's a location that you're at often, still make sure that plan hasn't changed. A lot of times schools will have construction or other events going on that may affect where the safe spaces are in case of inclement weather. What is the plan? It's important to know who at the site is going to make the call. Who is the referee? Who are the members of meet management? How is that call going to be made? Is it going to be, a PA announcement? If it's field events that there is no PA, is there a horn of some sort that is going to be used? Again, know where the safe spaces are. Where at that facility should individuals go? Is it everybody going back to their bus? Is there a gymnasium nearby? What is the plan? And make sure you communicate that plan. Many times when you arrive at the meet and there's a chance for severe weather, you know that in advance, and make sure you communicate to the coaches and the athletes during your pre-event meeting what the plan is and where they should go if that call is made. And also it's important to know that officials should also follow the plan. Many times you'll see the coaches and the athletes, exit the stadium, and then there's an official sitting on the bench under an umbrella at the field event. These safety protocols are in place not only for athletes and coaches, but officials just the same. When to suspend. There's pretty clear guidance from the OHSAA and the National Federation on when to suspend. The first one being, if you know the storm is coming and you want that time to evacuate the stadium, it is always wise to suspend the meet before the storm hits. This is a process that takes place a lot of times at the regional or the state meet where there are more officials and a larger meet management presence. But if you're the referee, make sure you're having that conversation with the games committee and with meet management, and make that decision ahead of time if you can on if you will suspend before the storm hits. Otherwise, if you haven't suspended before the storm hits, or it's a pop-up storm, at the first sound of thunder or sighting of lightning, you should suspend immediately and send everybody to the safe spaces. Once you have suspended competition and everybody is safe and in their bus or in the school or wherever they need to go, then you can turn your attention to when do we restart the meet, if you are able to restart the meet. The first rule of thumb is 30 minutes after the last lightning or thunder is seen or heard. It is safe to begin allowing people to re-enter the facility. It's important to note that, with that 30-minute rule, it could be 45 or 50 minutes after the last lightning or thunder that competition resumes, because you need to make sure you allow some warm-up time and time for people to re-enter, but you do not want them to re-enter until that 30-minute mark. Also, in 2018, guidance was shifted a little bit related to a lightning when no thunder is heard under very specific conditions. At night, under certain conditions, lightning flashes with no thunder could be seen from distant storms. These storms may not pose a threat. And in these specific cases, it may be safe to continue if no thunder can be heard and the flashes are low on the horizon. It's important in these instances to use the technology that we have, whether it be lightning detectors or smartphones or other smart devices, to really identify where the storm is, to see if it is safe to resume competition. If you don't have any of these devices around and you have any question in your mind, it is always better to wait longer than to rush back into competition. Weather can be very unpredictable, and we're going to learn a little more from a meteorologist from WNCN in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Two high-profile NFL games in the past week have been delayed due to weather, even though it wasn't raining at the time.
Yeah, it was pretty rough for the game last night, for one of those games. Tonight, CBS 17 meteorologist Rachel Dunzing is taking a close look at lightning and explains why that even though your chances of getting struck by it are small, you still need to pay attention to it and play it safe.
In 2020, 17 people were killed by lightning strikes, and so far this year, that number is down to 10. And that may seem like a small number, but not counting deaths, nearly 250 people every year are injured in some way due to lightning. Over the last 60 years, North Carolina has recorded more than 200 lightning-related deaths, ranking us third in the country for those fatalities, only behind Florida and Texas. Most of those deaths are from people just trying to enjoy time outside, but a majority are also from people playing sports, whether it's soccer, football, golf. If you are even outside with a storm nearby, you are in danger. So paying attention to the weather is critical. It's the cliche rhyme you hear us say all the time, but when thunder roars, go indoors. The reason we say it is because, in general, if you can hear thunder, the storm is close enough that you can be struck by lightning, since lightning can strike more than 10 miles outside of the parent thunderstorm. Yes, even when it's sunny. When this happens, it's called a bolt from the blue. The rule of thumb for sporting events, and what they dealt with last night in Kansas City, is to wait 30 minutes after the last lightning strike before resuming the game. And if you are caught outside for any reason during a storm, find an enclosed building or a car with the windows rolled up. Never take shelter under a tree, because if the tree gets struck by lightning, the current can jump to you if you're standing too close, and it can even travel through the ground. These are some of the most common ways people end up getting struck by lightning. The bottom line, we know it's frustrating when your sporting event is delayed due to lightning, but it's a lot easier to enjoy the game when you're not in the hospital recovering from a strike, or worse. In the studio, meteorologist Rachel Dunsing, CBS 17.
That video was very informational about the risks of lightning, and some more information about, how far those lightning strikes can travel. As we wrap up this second meeting, I want to first thank the Ohio Association of Track and Cross Country Coaches, specifically Andy and Anjanette, for the work they do with the student athletes in the state and their leadership in moving our sport forward. I also want to thank Dave Kirk and the late Dale Gabor for all of their work in putting together the seeded division. Without their perspective and forward-thinking nature, we would not be a leader in the country like we are now. And finally, I want to thank John Dobbinspec for his assistance in putting this together. John is the local interpreter in Youngstown and also serves as an assistant state interpreter. With that, that concludes the second statewide local interpretation meeting. You will have credit posted shortly for this meeting, and your credit for the previous local should be posted at this time. Again, one final reminder that if you have not completed your state rules interpretation meeting, please do so sooner rather than later to avoid late fees or suspension of your license. I thank you all for your time, and I thank you for what you do for the sport of track and field. Have a safe and fun season, and if you have any questions, please let me know.